Welcome back to this wonderful Sunday, where we will be continuing with Walt Disney and American Original, Section 5, Chapter 27. Like most of Walt Disney's projects, California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, had a long history. It dated back to the early 1930s when Walt decided to train a new generation of cartoonists so that he could accomplish his goals in animation. The result was a liaison with the Chouinard Art Institute, and Walt continued to support the school long after he had discontinued classes for animators. Chouinard had flourished after World War II because of large number of veterans who studied on there under the GI Bill of Rights. But poor management and an embezzling employee brought the school to the edge of insolvency in the late 1950s. Nelbert M. Chouinard, who had founded the school in 1921, asked Mark Davis, a Disney animator who had been a teacher at the school, if he thought Disney would donate a scholarship. Davis knew of Walt's respect for Mrs. Chouinard and suggested asking for a luncheon appointment to explain the school's plight. Walt met with Mrs. Chouinard and was immediately responsive. He remembered the Chouinard Art Institute had given Disney artists free classes when the studio could not afford to pay for them. He responded with money to help the school in its troubled period, and he contributed the studio's financial expertise. Walt realized that Chouinard's problems required more than periodic infusions of cash. He worked with his staff on ways to modernize the school, proposing a widened curriculum and a showcase where students could display and sell their art. Walt's own taste in art leaned towards the dramatic paintings of Rembrandt, Goya, Velázquez, and El Greco, as well as the illustrations of Paul Gustave Doré. He had also been influenced in his youth by the Ashcan school of American artists, particularly Robert Henri. But Walt was not opposed to abstract art. Indeed, portions of Fantasia, Dumbo, and other Disney cartoons features abstractionism. He believed students should find their own mode of expression after they had been schooled in the fundamentals of art. During a visit to Chouinard, he was irritated to see first-year students using paint rollers on canvases. He believed in an intermingling of the arts. What young artist needs is a school where they can learn a variety of skills, a place where there is cross-pollination. Walt's plan had a practical side. Such a school could provide future talent for his own as well as other Hollywood studios, fulfilling in a more formalized and broadened way the function of the Disney School for Animators in the 1930s. Walt commissioned economics research associates to survey the problems of Chouinard Art Institute and offer possible solutions. In time, there are 20 studios offering a variety of proposals, including a City of the Arts, a cluster of interrelated schools where students could polish their skills and market their works to help support their studies. The school project began to take form when Walt learned that Los Angeles Conservatory of Music was in the same condition as Chouinard. The conservatory, founded in 1883 when Miss Emily Valentine brought the first grand piano to Los Angeles, had been victimized by an embezzler, was declining rapidly because of faulty management, and was being supported largely by a single patron, Mrs. Richard Von Hagen, wife of a Los Angeles lawyer and businessman. Walt lunched with Mrs. Von Hagen, and they had an animated discussion about their problem schools. She proposed the concept of a college patterned after the California Institute of Technology, encompassing all the arts in the same manner that Caltech included the sciences. The new school would be called the California Institute of the Arts. CalArts began its history in 1962 with the merger of the Chouinard Art Institute and the Los Angeles Conservatory of Music. Walt embarked on planning a college for artists with the same thoroughness he had employed in conceiving Disneyland. He sent researchers across the country to visit art schools and conservatories, studying the curricula and facilities, measuring classrooms and corridor space. Walt sought advice from such administrators as Lee Dubridge of Caltech and Franklin Murphy of UCLA. He commissioned his own artists to create brochures and sketches of prospective campuses. As the concept of CalArts grew, he considered where the school should be located. He became enthusiastic about hilltop property across the Cahuenga Pass from the Hollywood Bowl. The land belonged to the County of Los Angeles, and the county supervisors agreed to release it for CalArts. All that was needed was permission by the state legislature, and the Democratic leader of the Assembly, Jesse Unruh, assured there would be forthcoming, but at the last moment, Walt decided against the property. He concluded that the steep slopes would make construction difficult. Most of all, he did not want to deal with government bureaucracy. His wartime experience remained vivid and painful. 36 other locations were considered until Walt and Roy decided on a simple solution. Walt Disney Productions would donate 38 acres of its Golden Oak Ranch, a 728-acre spread in Placerita Canyon north of San Fernando Valley. The ranch, where gold had been discovered by a Spaniard in 1842, had been bought by the studio in 1959 as a site for film locations. Walt talked about CalArts in a 1964 press interview in his office. We've got to fight against bigness. If a school gets too large, you lose an intimacy with the students. They begin to feel they're just part of a big complex. I don't think you can create as well in too big a plant. That's why I always try to avoid bigness in the studio. I like the workshop idea with students being able to drop in and learn all kinds of art. A kid might start out in art and end up as a talented musician. A school should offer a kind of cross-pollination that would develop the best in its students. I started out to be a political cartoonist. I grew up on my dad's socialist paper, Appeal to Reason, and I thought sure I was going to draw political cartoons. But then I took some children's classes at the Kansas City Art Institute. I went 2 winters, 3 nights a week, and my ideas about my future began to change. I learned a lot more from professional teachers at the Institute. They were more professional artists than teachers. Imagination is an intuitive thing. I think it's something you're born with, but it has to be developed. I learned a lot as a kid by going to vaudeville houses. The father of a friend of mine in Kansas City owned one, and we saw the shows 3 nights a week. When I moved to Chicago, I went to the vaudeville and the burlesque shows more often. One house had 18 acts of vaudeville. I saw every one and built my gag file. I might have become a political cartoonist, except that I was exposed to movie cartoons at the Kansas City Film Ad Company. There was a lot of cartoonists there, but none of them had my ambition to do anything else. The artist just did his work and turned it over to the cameraman to photograph. But I wasn't satisfied with that. I watched the cameraman do his work, and I asked questions. What's your exposure? Why do you shoot it that way? He was secretive at first, but then he told me all about it, and he let me run the camera once. So I learned. The trouble with universities is that they restrict students from learning about a lot of things. The young people have to get so many credits towards their degree, and they don't have a chance to delve into other subjects. That won't be true at CalArts. Students will be able to take anything: art, drama, music, dance, writing. They'll graduate with a degree of Bachelor's of Fine Arts, and if they want a Bachelor of Arts, they can go to other colleges and acquire a few more credits. The student body of CalArts shouldn't be over 2,000, and as many as possible should reside on campus. There should be some allowances for those who are talented yet are not students. They should be able to express themselves without worrying about grades. There'll be a lot of scholarships at CalArts. Those who can pay will pay. Those who can't, well, will get scholarships. We don't want any dilettantes at CalArts. We want people with talent. That will be the one factor in getting into CalArts. Talent. Walt's opposition to a second Disneyland weakened as his organization at WED matured in its skills. Walt saw the chance of doing something beyond duplication of a theme park. He concluded that another Disneyland could be used as the weenie to accomplish his greater goal, planning and building a new kind of city that would show how people could live in a clean, handsome, and stimulating community. The beginnings of his thinkings might be traced to the building of the Burbank studio in the late 1930s. Walt was able to plan the Burbank plant in every detail, down to the contour of the animator's chair. Disneyland was again the product of meticulous planning, and within the confines of the park, it worked. But Walt was appalled by how the promoters made a second-rate Las Vegas out of the periphery. After spending his adult life in Los Angeles, he had witnessed how the automobile had changed a sunny, attractive town into a concrete pavement, smog-choked metropolis. He wanted to combat the tyranny of the car and restore a degree of the comfortable life that his generation had known earlier in the century. Research began in 1958 when Walt commissioned Economics Research Associates to determine the most favorable location in the East for another Disneyland. The answer confirmed Walt's thinking: Florida. The weather allowed a year-round operation, which was necessary for such a large investment. The single drawback was Florida's population. Disneyland had been attracting between 60 to 65% of its 5,000 annual visitors from within the state, whereas Florida's entire population was 6,500,000. Walt wasn't concerned. We just got to get the folks up north to want to come down, he reasoned. Two more surveys were made in 1959, one to determine the best place within Florida, the other to evaluate the possibility of a city of tomorrow to surround the theme park. The research suggested Palm Beach as the most favorable location. RCA, which wanted to join with Disney in a theme park, began negotiations for 12,000 acres in North Palm Beach, but the two parties couldn't reach an agreement, and Palm Beach was dropped as a potential site. That suited Walt, who retained his prejudice against placing his park near the ocean. He didn't want to compete with the beach atmosphere. Furthermore, the Florida coast was subject to humidity and hurricanes. I want to be inland, he declared. We'll create our own water. In 1961, Walt ordered another survey to determine the ideal location. Ocala was the number one choice. Second, Orlando. Again, the Florida project was put aside as Walt embarked on the planning for the New York's World's Fair. In 1963, when design of the four exhibits nears completion, Walt decided to begin preparing another challenge for WED. He ordered a third evaluation of the Florida site. Previous findings had overlooked an important future route of the Florida freeway systems. The new data pointed to Orlando as the ideal location. In November 1963, Walt made a fateful flight to the east, along with Don Tatum, Card Walker, Joe Potter, Buzz Price, and Jack Sayers, a Disneyland executive. Walt sought a final location at the company's next theme park. The party stopped in St. Louis, where civic leaders had been seeking Disney's participation for a riverfront park as part of the rejuvenation of the city's downtown, but there was too little land and the financial risks seemed too great. Next came Niagara Falls, where Disney had been asked to join a development on the Canadian side. The long, cold winter precluded a profitable operation there. The site between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore was also rejected because weather would not permit year-round operation. The plane headed south. Walt directed the pilot to fly along the coast of Florida so that he could satisfy himself that he did not want to build a park on the ocean. The travelers headed inland, flying at a low altitude. Walt always liked to fly as low as possible to study the landscape. The plane circled over limitless swamps and forests near Orlando, and Walt peered down with calculating eyes. Then he ordered the pilot to New Orleans. As the Disney executives drove from the airport to their hotels, they noticed crowds of people huddled around radios and watching television sets in store windows. When Walt arrived at the hotel, he learned what had happened. President Kennedy had been shot. Walt was shocked and saddened, and he said little on the gloomy return flight to California. Before the plane arrived in Burbank, he remarked, "Well, that's the place, Central Florida." Walt and Roy agreed to seek enough property in Central Florida so the new project could be developed as a totality, avoiding the visual ruin of Anaheim. Robert Foster, Secretary and General Counsel of Disneyland, was assigned to the delicate operation of acquiring the land in a quiet manner that would prevent prices from soaring. He studied geodetic survey maps, searching Orlando, Ocala, and Lakeland newspapers for land offerings, read circulars from real estate dealers. In February 1964, Roy Disney and several executives flew to Florida. Walt was left behind for fear that he would be recognized. The travelers registered at hotels under assumed names and made unobtrusive surveys of the area. They reported to Walt that several large parcels of lands were available. "Okay, let's go after some land," he said. Robert Foster began operations in Florida, functioning with the secrecy of a James Bond. Through the New York law firm that represented Disney, Donovan, Leisure, Newton, and Irvine, he located a Miami lawyer, Paul Hallowell, who had important connections in the state. Without identifying his company, Foster told his purpose: to acquire a large parcel of land for recreational purposes, large enough for land use as well. Hallowell referred Foster to Roy Hawkins, a real estate dealer with statewide experience. Foster identified himself to Hawkins as Robert Price, his first two names, although he later disclosed his real identity and that of his employer to Hawkins. Foster's remained Bob Price in negotiations with landowners. In May 1964, Foster and Hawkins had narrowed their choices to three areas: one between DeLand and Daytona Beach, another near Osceola City, a third in Orange County near Orlando. Foster made a presentation to Disney executives in Burbank. arguing for the DeLand Daytona Beach property. Walt ended the proposal by interrupting. Bob, what in the hell are you doing way up there? He reminded Foster of surveys that showed the northern locations would be too cold for a year-round operation, and for the park's vegetation. The Osceola City property was owned by a state senator, Earl Bronson, who had a commitment to sell 2,500 of his 10,000 acres. The Disney efforts were centered on Orange County. There are three major areas: 12,000 acres owned by two cousins, Bay Lake property owned by 12 Orlando couples. Another lake area called Outages had several owners. By August, the three major holdings were tied down with options. Senator Bronson decided to sell his entire 10,000 acres at Osceola City, and the property was acquired by Disney as an alternative if the Orange County operation foundered. A crisis developed with the discovery that the owners did not control mineral rights. They belonged to a mineral company and Tufts College. After lengthy negotiations, both agreed to a settlement and relinquished their rights. The major problem was the outages. The lake property had been subdivided in 1913, and plots had been sold through mail-order catalogs. A 50-person task force traced descendants of the original buyers and offered to purchase the property. A conference room in Burbank contained a huge map of Orange County, and each day the state of acquisitions was plotted like territory won by troops in a war. Walt visited the room daily. Placing his palm over the intersection of two highways, he said, "Now this is very important to our future development. If we can get all the property here, we can do something imaginative with it. If we can't get it all, then we'll be stuck with something conventional." During one of the meetings, Bob Foster mentioned a large parcel that was available. "Buy it," Walt said. Roy protested that they had already committed themselves to a huge amount of acreage. "Yes, Roy," Walt replied, "but wouldn't you love to own 7,000 acres around Disneyland now? And anyways, we can always sell this parcel later if we have to." Walt couldn't resist seeing the property himself, even though he realized the danger if he were recognized. He flew off to Florida in the company plane with a few of his executives. When the plane stopped to refuel at a Florida airport, all of the travelers started heading for the terminal. One of them said to Walt, "You can't go. You'll be spotted." Walt grudgingly agreed to remain on the field. A young mechanic stared at him and remarked, "Aren't you Walt Disney?" "Hell no," Walt replied. "I get mistaken for him all the time, and if I ever run into that SOB, I'm going to tell him what I think of him." Walt viewed the proposed site from the air. The land was a broad vista of cypress groves and blackwater swamps, and it seemed a forbidding task to raise a theme park and a city of the future from the wilderness. But Walt was immensely pleased. "Yeah, it's gonna be fine," he said. Rumors continued to circulate in Orlando about who was buying options on the vast property. Some said it was Ford Motor Company, others suspected McDonnell Douglas or Disney. When Roy Hawkins sent postcards from Seattle to friends in Orlando, many citizens were convinced that Boeing was the mysterious purchaser. By October of 1965, less than 300 acres remained to be acquired. News reporters from the East were visiting the studio, and in a press conference, a representative of the Orlando Sentinel asked Walt if his company was buying land in Florida. He could have dodged the question with a half-truth. Instead, he replied, "I'd rather not say." That weekend, Bob Foster made a trip to Orlando with Joe Potter, the Army general who had been Robert Moses' chief of aide at the New York World's Fair, and recently joined the Disney organization. Using assumed names, they registered at a hotel, viewed the site from a helicopter, and tramped over the ground. When they returned to the hotel on Sunday, they saw a headline in the Orlando Sentinel. "We say mystery industry is Disney." Still hoping for secrecy, Potter used a pay telephone to call Card Walker and report that the news was leaking. Walt made the decision to announce the Florida Project. Potter and Foster flew to Miami to meet with the governor of Florida, Hayden Burns, who wanted to make the announcement himself the following day at a convention luncheon. And so the news was out. With land acquisitions unfinished, the price on the remaining parcels of land quickly rose from $183 per acre to $1,000, but Disney had been able to acquire options on 27,000 acres of Florida at a price of $5 million. On November 15th, a press conference was held at the Cherry Plaza Hotel in Orlando. With a politician's flourish, Governor Burns introduced Walt Disney as the man of the decade who will bring a new world of entertainment, pleasure, and economic development to the state of Florida. The governor termed Roy Disney the financial wizard of Walt Disney Productions. This is the biggest
This is the biggest thing we ever tackled, Walt began. I might, for the benefit of the press, explain that my brother and I have been together in our business for 42 years now. He's my big brother, and he's the one that when I was a little fellow I used to go to with some of my wild ideas, and he'd either straighten me out, put me on the right path, or if he didn't agree with me, I'd work on it for years until I got him to agree with me. But I must say that we've had our problems that way, and that's been the proper balance that we've been needing in our organization. And this project, though, I just like to say that I didn't have to work very hard on him. He was with me from the start. Now, whether that's good or bad, I don't know.
Members of the press asked about a model community for the employees of the Florida project, and Walt disclosed publicly for the first time his thinking about a city of the future.
I would like to be part of building a model community, a city of tomorrow, you might say, because I don't believe in going out to this extreme blue sky stuff that some architects do. I believe that people still want to live like human beings. There's a lot of things that could be done. I'm not against the automobile, but I just feel that the automobile has moved into communities too much. I feel that you can design so the automobile is there, but still put people back as pedestrians. You see, I love to work on a project like that. Also, I mentioned to the way of schools, facilities for the community entertainments, and the like. I'd love to be part of building up a school of tomorrow. This might become a pilot operation for the teaching age, to go out across the country and across the world. The great problem today is the one of teaching.
Walt set up a Florida project planning committee at WED consisting of himself, Joe Potter, and Mark Davis, who had a rare knack of putting Walt's ideas into form. Only the three men had keys to the room where the Florida plans were kept. Throughout the planning, Walt concerned himself with the overall concept of the Florida project and the design of the city of tomorrow, paying scant attention to the theme park. He asked his planners, "If you were going to build another Disneyland, how would you do it?" They decided they would build it exactly as before. The design for Disneyland was perfect. The only alteration would be better access between Fantasyland and Frontierland. The finding confirmed Walt's belief that he should concentrate his thinking on the city of tomorrow.
"We know how to build a theme park," he said. "The new one will be no different from Disneyland, except we'll have more water."
The city of tomorrow became an obsession. He wanted it to include every possible scientific advance, and he commissioned Joe Potter.
"Find out what industry is thinking about the future. What's going on in the research laboratories and the think tanks. Let's take advantage of their know-how in our own planning." Letters of inquiry were sent to 500 corporations, and over the months, Potter and other visited 100 factories, research centers, and foundations. Walt read omnivorously on city planning. Among the 14 surveys he ordered from Economics Research Associates was one on model cities. It revealed that planning communities had existed since 1900 BCE, when one was established in Egypt for builders of a pyramid. Of the 125 new cities that had been built in the United States by the mid-1960s, few could be considered successful. Most had repeated or compounded the errors of old cities. Walt was impressed by the new town's program of post-war England. Yet it seemed to have produced communities that were dull and drab. Walt was not discouraged. His natural optimism convinced him that environments of high quality could be planned so that people could live like human beings in the modern world. Nor was he discouraged by the failure of big corporations in efforts to create model cities. One major company had spent $100 million in research for a plan to establish 10 such cities, but the project came to nothing. Archaic building codes, protective labor unions, building material contractors, and short-sighted politicians inevitably made progressive change impossible. With his customary distrust of politicians, Walt Disney sought unprecedented freedom to develop the model city without interference. Don Tatum pointed out that what he really wanted was an experimental, absolute monarchy. Walt raised an eyebrow and asked puckishly, "Can I have one?" "No," Tatum replied. Walt needed a name for his future city. One day at lunch with his WED staff, he mused, "What we're talking about is an experimental prototype community of tomorrow." "What does that spell?" "Epcot. E-P-C-O-T. Epcot. That's what we'll call it. Epcot."
Thank you again for sharing your Sunday with me. I really appreciate it. And as always, remember that today's special moments are tomorrow's memories. Thank you for your time.